There's a version of the Old West that lives in film and folklore, where the cowboy rides tall against the horizon, unbothered by anything but outlaws and dust. That version collapses the moment winter arrives. The real test of the cowboy wasn't a gunfight at noon. It was the long, brutal stretch of months when the plains turned into a frozen battlefield and survival became a daily calculation against the cold. By the mid-1880s, winters across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas were not just harsh, they were lethal. Temperatures plunged far below zero, and when the wind came screaming across the open range, it stripped heat from the body faster than any fire could replace it. Men who misjudged the conditions didn't last long. Frostbite, exhaustion, and exposure were constant threats, and unlike today, there was no safety net waiting nearby. So the question isn't romantic, it's practical. How did these men working with nothing but wool, leather, and discipline stay alive in conditions that could kill within hours? The answer lies in systems. Systems of clothing, food, shelter, work, and mindset that were refined through necessity. This isn't nostalgia, survival knowledge, forged in one of the most unforgiving environments in American history. And if you pay attention, you'll notice something else. Many of those same principles still apply when modern comfort disappears. The first mistake that killed people in extreme cold was wearing the wrong material. Cowboys learned quickly that cotton had no place in winter survival. Once wet from sweat or snow, it held moisture against the skin and drained heat rapidly. Wool, on the other hand, became the foundation of survival. It trapped heat even when damp and created a barrier between the body and the environment. Layering wasn't optional, it was strategy. Long wool undergarments formed the base, followed by multiple shirts and a vest that protected the core without restricting movement. Mobility mattered because a man still had to work, ride, and react. But insulation mattered more, because without it, none of that work could continue. Leg protection was often overlooked in popular depictions, but in reality, it was critical. Standard denim stiffened in extreme cold and offered little resistance to wind. Cowboys relied on heavy wool chaps, sometimes made from Angora or lined with fur, to block wind and retain warmth. These weren't aesthetic choices, were the difference between maintaining circulation and losing it. Footwear was equally deliberate. Tight boots restricted blood flow, which invited frostbite. So winter boots were intentionally oversized, allowing space for thick wool socks or improvised insulation like hay or paper. It was crude, but it created air pockets that helped retain heat. The buffalo hide coat was perhaps the most important outer layer. Heavy, cumbersome, and nearly reaching the ankles, it acted like a portable shelter. When the wind cut across the plains, that coat blocked it in a way lighter garments never could. Combined with a properly wrapped neckcloth, often silk for its insulating properties, the cowboy could protect vital areas where heat loss was most dangerous. Everything had a purpose. Every layer served a function, and the lesson is straightforward. In extreme conditions, survival depends on choosing materials that work with your body, not against it. Cold weather doesn't just challenge the body externally, it forces it to burn energy at an accelerated rate just to maintain core temperature. Cowboys operating in sub-zero conditions required enormous caloric intake, often far beyond what most people consume today. Their diet reflected this reality. Fat was not avoided, it was sought after. Animal fat provided dense energy that burned slowly, giving the body a steady supply of heat. Beef, beans, and salt pork formed the backbone of most meals, not because they were appealing, but because they were effective. Salt pork, heavily preserved and durable, supplied both fat and salt, critical for maintaining bodily function during long, exhausting days. Beans added bulk and sustenance, while biscuits, often made from sourdough starter, provided carbohydrates that could be produced even in cold conditions if the starter was kept alive. Coffee played a central role, not just for warmth but for function. Strong, unfiltered, and consumed throughout the day, it helped maintain alertness and provided a psychological boost in an environment that constantly wore men down. The key takeaway here is that survival in cold environments is directly tied to energy management. Without sufficient calories, the body loses its ability to generate heat, and once that happens, everything else begins to fail. Cowboys didn't have the luxury of returning to well-built homes at the end of each day. Much of the winter was spent in line camps, small isolated cabins positioned across vast stretches of grazing land. These structures were basic, often constructed from rough timber, and reinforced with earth for insulation. Inside, space was limited. A small stove provided heat, but maintaining that heat required constant attention and a steady supply of fuel, which wasn't always available. When firewood ran out, alternatives like dried manure were used. It burned hot enough to provide warmth, even if it wasn't ideal. The goal wasn't comfort. It was survival through the night. When a cabin wasn't accessible, the bedroll became critical. More than just blankets, these were layered systems designed to trap heat and block moisture. Cowboys often slept fully clothed, loosening their boots rather than removing them to prevent freezing or swelling. Improvised solutions were common. Heated stones placed near the feet could provide temporary warmth. In extreme situations, animals themselves became sources of heat, their body warmth helping prevent freezing. Shelter in any form served one purpose: reducing exposure. Even a small barrier between a person and the elements could mean the difference between life and death. Isolation during winter was relentless. Storms could trap men in confined spaces for days or weeks, cutting them off from the outside world. Under those conditions, mental resilience became just as important as physical preparation. Small irritations became magnified. Limited space, constant noise, or the absence of stimulation could push individuals toward conflict or despair. Cowboys developed ways to manage this pressure. Simple activities like carving, reading, or playing cards helped maintain focus and prevent mental stagnation. Music and storytelling were more than entertainment. They were tools for maintaining morale. Singing or playing an instrument filled the silence and created a sense of connection, even in isolation. Humor also played a role. Exaggerated stories and dark jokes helped reframe hardship, making it more manageable. It didn't change the conditions, but it changed how those conditions were experienced. The lesson here is clear. Survival isn't just about enduring physical hardship. It's about maintaining mental stability when conditions become overwhelming. Winter didn't pause responsibilities. It intensified them. Cattle still needed water, and in freezing conditions that meant breaking through thick layers of ice daily. This was physically demanding work that required careful pacing to avoid sweating excessively, which could lead to rapid heat loss once activity stopped. Blizzards created additional challenges. Herds would drift with the wind, often ending up trapped against fences or in areas where survival was impossible. Cowboys had to intervene, guiding animals toward natural shelter or clearing obstacles to prevent mass loss. Navigation during storms was another risk. Whiteout conditions eliminated visibility, making it easy to become disoriented. Ropes were sometimes used to connect key structures, allowing movement without losing direction. There were no days off. Every task carried consequences, and failure to act could result in significant loss. Survival wasn't just personal. It extended to the animals and the operation as a whole. Healthcare on the frontier was minimal. Illness or injury required immediate, often improvised responses. Whiskey was commonly used both as a disinfectant and a form of pain management, despite its drawbacks. Respiratory illnesses were particularly dangerous. Cold air and constant exposure increased the risk of conditions that could quickly become fatal without proper treatment. Remedies were often based on available materials rather than proven effectiveness. Frostbite required careful handling. Gradual warming using body heat was the safest method, avoiding further damage that could result from rapid temperature changes. The broader lesson is that in survival situations, understanding basic principles of care and acting quickly can compensate for a lack of advanced resources. All of these survival strategies were tested during one of the most devastating winters in the history of the American West. After a summer of drought, the land was already strained. When winter arrived early and intensified, it created conditions that overwhelmed both cattle and the men responsible for them. Blizzards buried grazing land, making it impossible for animals to access food. Temperatures dropped to extreme levels, and the cumulative effect led to massive losses. Entire herds perished, and the economic impact reshaped the cattle industry. This event marked a turning point. Open-range practices gave way to more controlled systems, including fenced land and managed grazing. It was a shift, driven by necessity, a recognition that the environment could not be taken for granted. The lesson remains relevant. Preparation and resilience can carry you far, but they must be paired with respect for the limits imposed by nature. The cowboys who endured these winters weren't defined by myth. They were defined by discipline, adaptation, and an understanding of their environment. They didn't rely on comfort. They relied on preparation. They wore what worked, ate what sustained them, built shelter where they could, and maintained their mental edge in isolation. They showed that survival is not about a single skill, but a system of decisions made consistently under pressure. Those lessons still apply. Whether facing extreme weather or any challenging environment, the principles remain the same. Prepare properly, manage energy, protect your body, maintain your mindset, and never underestimate the conditions you're dealing with. If this breakdown gave you a deeper understanding of real historical survival, subscribe to Intelligent Survival for more content that goes beyond the surface and into what actually kept people alive. Share this with someone who thinks survival is just about toughness, because now you know it's about much more than that.